There we go. Nice and smooth. All right. Well, welcome back, house kids. Eric here. Today is Saturday, February 20th. I hope you have had an awesome week. Let's get to the lesson. We have been in 1 Samuel. And if you recall in 1 Samuel, last week we learned about David having mercy over Saul, which was awesome. Saul was jealous of David because he knew David was going to be king one day because he was anointed to be king and Saul was king. He didn't like that. So Saul got to the point where more than once he tried to kill David. And David had the opportunity to kill him and he did not. He gave it all to God and said, I'm not going to kill him. That's up to God. And so here we are. We're now going to fast forward a little bit into 2 Samuel. So we're no longer in 1 Samuel. Now we're in the second part of Samuel, Samuel 2, and we're in chapter 6 and 7 today. All right? So eventually, Saul dies and David becomes king, just as it was said that he was going to be king. And so David becomes king. And when he becomes king, there's finally this peace with the Israelites and God's people. You see, even though they made it to the promised land, they never really settled down. They didn't actually have peace. There was still wars. They were always fighting just with their evil neighbors, and they never had a chance to settle down. Well, now David's king, and there's this kind of this peace over the land, and David ends up in this huge palace, and it's made out of cedar wood, and it's huge and amazing, and he lives in a place that's called the City of David. And there's one point in chapter 6 where David goes through the process of bringing the Ark of the Covenant and the whole tabernacle. Remember, that was the tent that God had them build, that he would dwell within the Ark of the Covenant, the most holy of items for them, and they would travel with that. And that was kind of like a traveling little temple, but it was really just a tent. And so he's going through this process of bringing the tent and the ark back into the city of David just outside his palace. And when it arrives and it's finally there, there's like this huge party, a giant celebration, and David's like dancing, yeah, we got the ark is back. And so the Ark of the Covenant is there and everything. And now one day, David says to Nathan, who was a prophet at that time, he says, Nathan, doesn't it seem a little unfair that I live in this huge palace and God and the Ark of the Covenant are in just this little tent? That doesn't seem right. I would like to build God an amazing palace for him to be in. And Nathan says, well, go ahead and do that. God's good with whatever you say. However, God wasn't really good with that. And so God corrected Nathan. And later that evening, God spoke to Nathan, the prophet, and said, Nathan, this is what I want you to tell David. So, David, you plan on building me a palace? Did I ask for you to build me a palace? I brought all of my chosen people out of the land of Egypt. I gave them leaders along the way to help guide them. I gave them everything that they needed. I never asked for a palace. If I wanted a palace, I could have at any time asked for a palace. You don't need to go and build me a palace. You, David, are going to have a son one day, and that son, I'll have him build me a palace. I will love that son like I love you. I will have him build me a palace. And you know what? That son, he will have a son that will end up being king also. And eventually, one of your family grandchildren down the line is going to be king forever. And so this was a promise that God made to David, right? And so Nathan told all this to David, and David was amazed. He felt kind of like, oh my goodness, I don't deserve God. And so he prayed to God and he said, God, there is none like you. I don't deserve you. You bless me with these things. you are so amazing, God. What would I do without you? And he says, Lord, I pray these promises come true. And we know now that these promises did come true. We'll find out later that his son ends up becoming king, David's son, and he ends up building a palace for God because God asked him to. And we also find out that eventually through their family line is Jesus. And we know that Jesus becomes king, but he doesn't become just a regular old king. God's promise was he was going to be king forever. Jesus isn't king of England or, president of the United States or king of Mesopotamia. Jesus is king of all kings. Jesus is king of the universe, of heaven and earth, forever. And that promise that he gave to David came true, right? And in this story, we learn there's a lot of things in here, but a couple things. One, we have God doesn't need a palace, right? There's nothing that we could build for him or make for him that he needs. He doesn't need a palace. If he did, he'd already have one. He'd just build it or have us build one for him. But what God wants, because there's nothing we could give him that he needs, but what he wants is for us to spend time with him, for us to include him in our lives, and for him to guide us. That's what he wants from us, right? And so this is a great story where it shows that. It also shows that God's promises, as we've learned before, remember, God does make lots of promises. He made a promise to Abraham, to Isaac. Remember, there was also a promise not that long ago to Moses and the Israelites through the commandments and everything. But we know that God's promises always come true. God is the one that we can trust more than any other being that ever was and ever will be, because he'll never lie. We can always have faith in him, right? And so this is a great story of God's promise to David about Jesus. And it came true. Hey, I got some printouts for you. If you go in the description below, you'll see a link to a folder which has the little cartoon video for this Bible story, so you can watch that. That's fun. And there's also 2 printouts you can print out. You got this coloring page, and look right here. It says God promised that the Messiah would come from David's family, and he did. You can color this however you want. Look, you could give David purple hair even. It don't matter. Have fun with that. Be creative. God made you to be creative. And this is an activity sheet called Family Line. And this is kind of fun because you're going to start here at Abraham. And it says to follow the winding line and find the correct order of the selected names from Jesus's family line. And so you go down here, Abraham, and woo! It's kind of like a crazy little roller coaster. And along the way, you can see the order that there was all these names that were within the family line of Jesus. How much of an honor is that to be in that family line? Very cool. So that's this story, you guys. Hope you'd enjoy it. And I hope you have a great week. I will see you next time. You take care. Let's see if I can get back in this thing here. Seatbelts first, kids. All right? That's not it. No! No!